Ready to go. So I'm going to pass the baton to Teresa Meyers, and she's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Vermont, and she's affiliated with the Transdisciplinary Research Initiative in Food Systems, and she came to UVM in 2011, so welcome. Her research takes a community-based and ethnographic approach and focuses on the intersection of food and migration studies. Teresa is particularly interested in the ways that the diets and foodways of Latino immigrants change as a result of migration. So Teresa is currently working on a project on food access and food security among Latino and Latina dairy workers in Vermont. So welcome, Teresa.
So I'm really excited to introduce the second of our outstanding keynotes for the Food Systems Summit, Dr. Eric Holt-Giménez. Eric is currently the director of Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy based in Oakland, California, though as I'll get to in a minute, this is one of many hats he wears. So I'm a member of the Food Systems Steering Committee, and several months ago when we were approached for our input on the keynotes for this event, I think the question wasn't even finished. I'm like, we need to bring Eric, we need to bring Eric. And luckily, I didn't have to wage any kind of campaign. People were really quickly convinced of the kinds of perspectives that he would offer to this event. So my first introduction to Eric and his work took place during the events connected to the 10th anniversary of the WTO protests that shut down the city of Seattle in 1999. And I was this sort of PhD candidate, lots of angst happening. I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to say in my dissertation. And I was really in need of some inspiration. So Eric was one of the featured speakers for the protest anniversary, and one comment that he made 5 years ago still really resonates with me as I'm doing farm visits and working here in Vermont. He said, you know, there's this sick joke amongst older farmers here because the average age of a farmer in the United States is approaching 60 right now. And the joke is that in 10 years, the average age of the American farmer is going to be dead. Nonetheless, this country is full of farmers. They are standing on the street corners looking for work. They come from Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Colombia, Panama. They've been displaced. They mow our lawns, they pump our gas, they cook our food in the fancy restaurants. Those are farmers. We're surrounded by farmers. They're just out of work. So this commentary, to me, really represents Eric's unique ability to connect our everyday experiences with food as growers, as eaters, as scholars, as activists, with these really broad political economic conditions and movements that are shaping our global food system. He has written about these connections in countless magazine and academic articles on agroecology, development, food justice, and food sovereignty, and he's also the author and editor of several Food First books, the most recent of which is called Food Movements Unite: Strategies to Transform Our Food System. Additionally, he publishes regularly in more public outlets like the New York Times and the Huffington Post. Eric lectures internationally and has taught at the University of California, Boston University, Antioch University in Colombia, and the National Gastronomic University of Italy. And as I realized on Monday, as we were having Eric visit some of the farm worker gardens that were growing up in Franklin County, he can also change a spare tire in about 5 minutes. So if this food movement leader thing doesn't work out, he's got a really good sort of second job as a pit crew member. Dr. Eric Holt-Giménez has a PhD in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz and a master's in international agricultural development from UC Davis. At Food First, Eric's research and writing has concentrated on the global food crisis, the U.S. Farm Bill, the expansion of agrofuels, land grabs, neighborhood food systems, and food movements. In short, pretty much everything we're talking about here over these 2 days. Today, his talk is entitled Food Crises, Food Regimes, and Food Movements. And I have no doubt that if there's a PhD student out there in need of some inspiration, you're going to find it in the next few minutes. So please join me in welcoming Eric to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank UVM for this invitation, and I'm really honored to be able to participate in this extraordinary event. And I say extraordinary because, I often participate in activist events like, the celebration of the WTO protests in Seattle, or I talk at, academic events, and I present research and whatnot. But it's not too often I have the opportunity to present to academics and farmers and researchers and activists all in one room. And I think this is a really good sign. I think it's a very good development. And so I'm really pleased to be here. I've got a lot of ground to cover, and so I'm going to speak very quickly. I hope I don't move too fast, but there are a number of things I want to share with you. How do we understand our food system? What's a good way of understanding a system, any system? One of the best ways of understanding a system is to look at it when it's in crisis and study it, see how it reacts. What does it uncover? Particularly natural disasters are a really good time to understand both the environment and society, because all kinds of things happen in a disastrous situation, and we begin to understand sort of the inner workings of our society, the inner workings of our relationship with the environment, what's wrong, what's right, and what needs to be changed. I would say that our food system today, a lot of people say it's broken. I don't think it's broken. I think it's working precisely as a food system during a period of late capitalism is supposed to work. It's disastrous. And so I'll explain more what I mean by that, but it provides us with a unique opportunity, I think, to understand the food system and to understand ourselves and to understand what the possibilities are for transformation. So the first time a lot of us were alerted to the crisis of the food system was with the food crisis of 2008, when we began to have food riots around the world. The price of food shot up, and suddenly we have riots in places where you would expect, like Haiti, where people were subsisting on mud biscuits, and then the price of food goes up, and so they begin to riot. Sub-Saharan Africa, we had food riots, but then we had riots in places you wouldn't have expected, like Mexico, Italy, or Wisconsin. So clearly, this wasn't about a lack of food. Actually, we'd never produced more food in the history of the world than we did in 2008 at the time. But it was about high prices. So you get a combination of high prices and poverty and a lack of entitlement, a lack of democracy about how all this food which is actually produced is going to be distributed, then you get these riots. Now, these happened in 2008. This is a graph of the food price index produced by the FAO. So you can see in 2008, the current and constant prices spike, and that leads to these food riots. And the red lines, the vertical red lines, dotted red lines, that is the frequency of riots, of food riots. So you can see that when the food price index gets up over 190 or something, you begin to get food riots. Well, shortly after 2008, everybody got very concerned about this. Hundreds of people died in these riots. And so more food was released onto the market, and the price came down, and everything was fine until 2011, when we get another spike in food prices. And then we really get riots. This is when we get the Arab Spring. Every single one of the countries in Africa that revolted started the revolt with a food riot. Food touched off the revolt. And so what that means, of course, is that if you happen to live in a country in which there is low food security and then food prices go up and you're dependent on the world price for your grain, then you can expect a riot. Now, people were calling these riots. And after we looked at them for a while, we realized that really wasn't accurate. You think about a riot, you think about food riot, hungry people, empty bellies, clenched fists, breaking down the doors to the warehouses where the USAID rice gift from the people of the United States is kept. I'm describing Haiti. right? Where people had been starving for some time. And then, the straw that broke the camel's back was the price goes up. When they rioted, they did not storm the warehouses where the USAID rice, gift from the people of the United States, was kept. They stormed the National Palace. They drove the Prime Minister off the island. These were political rebellions against an unjust food system which was incapable of solving a very simple equation. Here's the food, here's the hungry people, can't we just get them together? No. Impossible. Couldn't do it. So really, this is much deeper than just a problem of price and riots. Now, you can see this is very disturbing. The leaders of the world look at this and they say, gee, we've got to do something about this food price volatility, because if this keeps up, look at the curves there. Those curves are rising, which means that if the price of food continues to rise as it has been, the world will enter into a state of rebellion. And those governments which are weak can expect to be overthrown or expect to have full-scale rebellions. Well, it turns out this is bad for governments, but good for business. If you look back over time, back to about 1900 here, you can see that we've got these spikes back in 1917, just before World War I, another in 1951, right after World War II, 1974 with the oil crisis. Yesterday, Eric was also talking about how the price of oil and the price of food mirror each other. But it's not until 2008 we get these riots where they just shoot off the top of the charts. Highest prices we've ever seen for food. But there's a strange thing. If you look at this graph, you see that the green line there with the X's, that's the amount of food production per capita from 1990 through 2008. It's increasing by about 12% a year. That means every year, every one of us should have gotten 12% more food. Now, you can take this back for another 20 years. This has been the case for half a century. For half a century, we've had 1.5 times enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the planet. And yet we keep hearing, oh my God, we've got to double food production. We've got a population crisis. We've been overproducing for nearly half a century. And I would submit that it's not scarcity, but overproduction which causes hunger. I'll tell you why in a moment. Oh, and by the way, the blue dots there, that's absolute poverty. Absolute poverty hasn't changed. And the yellow dots, that's undernourishment. Undernourishment hasn't changed. So even though we keep on producing more and more food, people keep going hungry. All right? And it's not because there's not enough to go around, because remember, each one of us was supposed to get 12% more each year. So you could say, well, it's a problem of distribution. It is, but I think it goes deeper than that. Because if you look at both in 2008 and then again in 2011, we had record harvests and we had record hunger. Over 1 billion people were going hungry at the height of the food crisis, and we had record profits from the multinationals, the monopolies that control the world food system. So 1 billion people are going hungry when ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, sees their profits go up by 20%. Monsanto's profits go up by 45%. Cargill's profits go up by 86%. They have an arm called Mosaic that produces fertilizer. Their profits went up by 1,400%. At a time of record harvest, where 1 billion people were going hungry on the planet. Hunger is a big business. General Foods, 61%. You would lump in with General Foods the same pattern with Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, all the big hypermarkets. This is a funny little graph. So there, on your left is the graph we've seen. There in 2008, we get the spike of the food price index in red. It goes down, and then in 2011, it goes up again. And there's a blue line, and that's the local food price index. That's what you pay for things in the store. So the red line is what you pay globally for grain, and then the blue line is what you pay in the store. So you can see that after the price of food drops precipitously, the price of food in the store stays the same. So who makes their money there? Walmart, Carrefour, Tesco, Safeway. That's where those monopolies make their money. Now, the other graph, which looks a lot like the food price index graph, is Monsanto's stock shares. So Monsanto's stock goes up as people go hungry, and Monsanto's stock goes down when people are fed. Now, these tremendous windfalls for the monopolies who control our food system are great for a few minutes, and then they are a problem. Why? Well, imagine I'm a bank, and all of you decide to put $10,000 into my bank, into the Bank of Eric. I'm happy for about 30 seconds. And then I got to get on the phone or on the fax or on the internet or into social media, wherever it is I've got to go, because I got to loan your money out. Because I got to pay you interest. I've got a problem. I've got what's called a crisis of accumulation. So these companies have a crisis of accumulation. They've made mega profits, and they don't know what to do with their money. Because if they don't reinvest that money very quickly, the shareholders will take the money out of those companies, as they have with Monsanto. So what does Monsanto need? It needs another food crisis. It got one. Well, there was a lot of talk about the food crisis. And in the popular media, and the not so popular media, this is kind of what you heard. Oh, climate is changing, we've had some droughts, you know. Well, we did, but we still overproduced. Well, we have rising meat consumption in India, China, and Brazil. They're trying to eat meat like Americans, you know, and it's all grain-fed. And so they're putting pressure on the price of grain. Well, that's not the whole story, because actually who is opening up the feedlots in India and China? It's Smithfield Tyson with World Bank money. So you can't exactly blame the Chinese for trying to eat like Americans when it's American companies over there making money over the fact that the Chinese have more meat in their diet. We did have a small fall in cereal production, and we had low grain reserves. Well, that's true, but nobody asked why we had low grain reserves. Why do we have low grain reserves if we've been overproducing for 50 years? And of course, we did have higher oil prices, and since so much of our food travels on an average of something like 2,500 miles between producer and consumer, and fertilizer, so much of food is dependent on fertilizer, and the fertilizer costs went up. Well, that makes sense. Half of the world's grain goes to industrial uses, so if the price of oil or the price of palm oil or the price, cooking oil or goes up, well, then food price is going to go up. We had a weak dollar that also drives food price up. But then we had a combination of all these things, and then suddenly we get these big spikes. I would say like biofuels, there's a lot of analysis about this from the World Bank and USDA and others. And, blaming biofuels. Well, biofuels is taking land out of food production and putting it into fuel production. Well, that's true. But we had all these other factors as well. I think biofuels just pushed things over the edge because all of a sudden, food became very interesting. And commodity index funds began to invest in food. And you had an explosion of investment, speculation with food, pumping up that price, right? And I think that basically is what happened. There are no controls on that. And so we get a price spike. And then, the World Food Program releases some food into the markets and whatnot. The price drops, but boom, we get it again. And now we've got it again. So tremendous volatility in the market because the financial houses can now speculate on food, as can all of the monopolies. But I don't think that really gets to the issue. I think those were all proximate causes. If we look at the root causes, basically we have a very vulnerable food system. And when over 90% of our cropland is dedicated to just a handful, 5 different products, and there's only a handful of varieties, you can see we are environmentally vulnerable and subject to environmental shock. We were talking yesterday with Roz about the palm oil. There's only one variety of palm. So when all those plantations get some sort of pathogen, it's all over. But we're also highly vulnerable to economic shock, tremendous volatility, because we've taken all the controls off the market, all the controls off the financial market. We don't have grain reserves anymore. Grain reserves, the price went down too low, buy it up, the government would buy it up, put it in reserve, and raise the price. Price went up too high, the government would release the grain, bring the price down, keep that price stable. That's what farmers want, and that's what consumers want. But that's not what speculators want. They want volatility. That's where you make your money, is on the volatility. We basically have an industrial agri-foods complex dominated by the big grain traders and processors, the seed and genetic engineering companies, and the giant retailers and distributors. This didn't happen overnight. There are 3 steps. We could go back to the time of colonialism, but let's just start in the 1960s with the Green Revolution that Roz mentioned yesterday. This was basically a campaign initiated by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, who had saturated the markets in the United States with their machinery and fertilizers, and they needed a place to sell their stuff. So they had to transfer the model of industrial production from the United States to the Third World to develop a market. So they launched the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution supposedly saved 1 billion people from hunger, and Norman Borlaug gets the World Food Prize, and it's tremendously successful in spreading the industrial model of agriculture around the world. But no one talked about the 1 billion people who became hungry as a result of the Green Revolution. And if you look at the heyday of the Green Revolution between 1970 and 1990, the total food available per person in the world rose by 11%. So per capita, remember I said 12%? Well, 11% during the height of the Green Revolution. And we have a 16% drop in the number of hungry. But if you take China out of this equation, this always happens. When you say, oh, we're reducing the number of hungry people. Just take China out of the equation. It looks very different in the Western world. So the world minus China basically see no change. You have an increase of food per capita 11%, but you have an increase in the number of hungry people by 11%. In South America, you have an increase of food per capita of 8%, but you have an increase in hungry people by 19%. And in Southeast Asia, it stays the same. So what happened was there were tremendous successes in areas where there had been land reform, where there was equitable distribution of resources and whatnot. And then those successes were used to explain the entire Green Revolution without looking at the warts. Well, these are some pretty big warts. I was in Central America in the 70s and 80s, and I can speak from experience. There was a tremendous increase in fertilizer use, almost doubled it. And the increase in basic grain production was phenomenal, 45 million tons per year. But average yields dropped, right? And per capita production remained constant. So what happened? There was an expansion of the agricultural frontier, and we lost half of the tropical rainforests. Now, how does this work? They say the Green Revolution benefited farmers. Well, it benefited the middle farmer, who then got to be a bigger farmer. But it shoved the small farmer out of production because they didn't have irrigation, they didn't have machinery, they didn't have proper ownership of their land, they couldn't get the loans, and so they were pushed off the bottom land, pushed off the good land, and pushed up into the hillsides, the fragile hillsides, and out into the agricultural frontier where they had to chop down the rainforest to find nutrients. And so you had a doubling of land, and that's where all the production came from. It wasn't through the miracle seeds and because of the fertilizers. It was an incredibly violent and painful process, and inherently unsustainable. But very profitable for Pioneer, Hybrid, Cargill. The second step in the construction of the food regime, the industrial agri-foods complex, which I'm going to start calling the food regime, you'll see why in a minute, were the structural adjustment policies of the 80s and 90s. These remove all the tariff barriers between countries. They dismantle all of the marketing boards which govern supply to keep us from having oversupply. And they push the third world into non-food export crops, and they dismantle all of the reserves. Why? Because they wanted the South to buy its food from the North. Right? Why? Because the North was overproducing. I mean Europe and the United States primarily. The third step in the construction of this food regime was a free trade mania, which we're still going on today, in which we established the World Trade Organization and the free trade agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA, which basically take these structural adjustment policies, which were imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and cement them into international treaty. So that we can overproduce in the North and then dump the surpluses in the South and destroy the agriculture of the people in the South and destroy their capacity to feed themselves. Now, this sounds pretty diabolic, but there's a certain capital logic behind all of this. Now, why would they want all these free trade agreements? You already had the structural adjustment policies. And the answer is very simple. Because people cannot change free trade agreements. You can't vote a free trade agreement out of power. You can vote a party out of power, you can vote a president out of power, and you can say, don't sign any more structural adjustment policies, don't pay back that loan to the World Bank, whatever it is. But you can't do that if it's in a treaty. So they basically insulated the food system from any democratic influence possible. And that's why I call this a food regime. Right? What were the results? Well, the Global South used to produce a surplus of food back in the 1970s, about $1 billion surplus a year. Now they have a deficit of $11 to $12 billion a year. They buy their food from the North. So they've become dependent on the North. So when the price of food goes up, people go hungry. Industrial agriculture produces up to 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. Some people say 12, depends on what you figure in. You can say 12 to 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. That's why I really get upset when people say agriculture produces 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. Wait a minute. What type of agriculture are we talking about? It's not the same. Uses up 8% of the world's fresh water. We've lost 75% of our crop diversity. The genetic material which was used for the green revolution was basically stolen from the farmers around the world, the peasant classes around the world, who had all these land races which they've been developing for centuries. That was taken, put in gene banks, put in seed banks, and used at the Centers for International Agricultural Research to produce the hybrids. Right? So, Philippines, for example, where farmers once grew something like 2,000 varieties of rice, now they grow 4. Where is all the rice? In the refrigerators at the Center for International Agricultural Research called Erie. And it's rotting in the refrigerators because you have to grow it out every year or every couple of years. You've got to grow it out and replace it. They're not doing it. They're not keeping up. That's why they're putting it up under the ice in the northern ice cap because under the permafrost because it's starting to rot. All these seeds, these land races were starting to rot. Now, they can't grow them out up there, and as was mentioned, it's not about the seed. They don't care about the seed. They care about the DNA, right? And who owns that DNA. So this isn't about farmers anymore, right? This is about the companies. This is about the corporations. I think one of the most egregious results of these developments has been coerced immigration. Just in the first couple of years of NAFTA, over 1 million Mexican smallholders went bankrupt because of the grains being dumped, subsidized grains being dumped and sold at under the costs of production. Farmers could never compete. They went out of business and came to the United States. And as Teresa mentioned, they're here. They're milking your cows. cutting your lawns, if they're working in your fancy restaurants, go to the back of the house. You'll find them. They're all farmers. And then the tremendous profits, and this is where the monopolies really become monopolies. And this is where they become giants. This is where they get tremendous market power to determine who eats and who doesn't eat, who gets land, who doesn't get land, who gets to farm, who doesn't get to farm. Now, even though there's a lot of money being made, this is destabilizing. And it's destabilizing governments around the world, and that's bad for business. And so the G20 got together in Italy, and then again got together in Paris, and the FAO said, look, we've destroyed agriculture in the global south. It's going to cost $40 billion to rebuild it. FAO pulls a lot of numbers out of their sleeve. $40 billion. Oh, okay. Well, they said, how about we give you 20? So they promised $22 billion to reconstruct the agriculture of the global south. But then along comes the Great Recession, and everybody forgets about all these promises. So less than a 20th of that money has actually been given. Right? And not much of it was new money anyway. Then we get this phenomena called land grabs. Now, where's this coming from? Something like 88 million acres have been grabbed. You know, it's like the size of California around the world. And basically, these are poor farmers being pushed off their land, make way for biofuels, you know, or make way for nothing, and just grab the land and hold it. Why? Because of the tremendous crisis of accumulation within the financial system, within the financialized food system. Your money's really not worth anything. I hate to tell us all that. All this paper stuff that gets passed around. And then say nothing about the fictitious money, electronic money that gets sloshes around the world. Well, this gets people nervous if you have a lot of it. And particularly if there's a tremendous accumulation of wealth and there's also a tremendous growing of poverty. So people can't buy the products which are produced. So we have a recession. So what are you going to do with all your money? Put it in land. They're not making any more of that. So you get this tremendous run on land. And what it looks like in the South is you just take the land. Just push people off it. And you may or may not be growing anything, agrofuels, palm oil, or getting after the minerals, natural gas. In the United States, you don't push people off the land, but you get them to sell the land. And the land enters into the global financial markets. So now we have a thing called like gold with yield. That's how they look at land these days. Because basically the value of the land is in the financial asset, not as a productive asset. So the gold is the financial asset. And this is just being traded internationally every second as we talk. The land in the Midwest is being traded on international markets. Right? The farmers don't own it anymore. Now, this is just a start. We don't know if this is a bubble, but it's a very disturbing trend. Why? Because of the terrible concentration of wealth worldwide over the last 20 years. You know, it was only 10 years ago we had about 500 billionaires. You know how many we have now? 1,500. Multi-billionaires. And they don't know what to do. They have a tremendous crisis of accumulation. Economies are not growing. They got together in Davos last year and they said, boy, it would be great if we could just ensure that the world economy would grow 2%. That's not growth. 12%, 15%, that's growth. The world economy isn't growing. It's stagnated. So capital is entrenching within our food system. Now, there's been some initiatives to combat hunger. You have Feed the Future and the Global Food Security Act here, the Global Harvest Initiative, which is a corporate initiative, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is Bill Gates' pet project. You know, they say that the Green Revolution skipped Africa, poor Africa, and now we're going to bring the benefits of the Green Revolution to Africa. The CGIAR system invested 2/3 of its budget into Africa for over 20 years trying to make the Green Revolution stick, and they couldn't do it. didn't skip Africa, it failed. But they're back again. And then we have the G20 promises, which have not been met. And we have the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. Now, all of these talk about private-public partnerships as a way of feeding the world. But what that means is that, yes, we'll feed the world if we can make money at it, right? And there's a problem where you confuse need and demand. See, there's not much demand. People don't have money. There's tremendous need. So this cannot be solved just through the market. There's a structural problem. And you hear ad nauseum that we've got to increase production 70% by 2050 or we're all going to die, you know. Look, we produce enough food right now to feed 10 billion people. That's what we expect the world population to max out on. 10 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion. You know, a billion here, a billion there. Anyway, we produce enough for everybody already. But too much of it goes to cars, and too much of it goes to cows, and not to people. And people can't afford the food which is being produced, because you push them off the land and destroy their livelihoods. Now, the fact is that most of the world's food, close to 70% of the world's food, is produced by whom? Not Cargill, not Monsanto. It's produced by peasants. And in fact, it's produced by women. Something like 70% of the world's peasants are women, and they produce nearly 70% of the world's food. And do you know who 70% of the world's hungry are? Women peasants. Right. So, did you ever wonder where this 70% by 2050 came from? Why do we have to double production? Why do we have to get up to 70% by 2050, even when we're already overproducing now? Where did that come from? I mean, you just hear this over and over and over again. And people accept it as fact. Well, it actually came from two publications. One was an Earthscan publication, and then there was a journal publication after that. But basically, these were projections that economists made based on demand. And they basically said, no, what we expect is that food production will increase by 70% by 2050 based on the demand trends that we see. They didn't say we had to do that. Right? But somehow this got flipped around into a prescription. Why? Because, I think you can answer that yourself. Because big food is big money. And if we can convince everybody that we've got to invest in industrial agriculture, then we can continue to grow, and we're not going to experience these tremendous losses in stock shares in between food crises. Anyway, basically, the mantra is always the same. We've got to increase food production. We need another green revolution, this time led by GMOs. And we're going to have these private-public partnerships. This is going to be a market-led thing. We'll back it with some aid. We need to sign the Doha round for the World Trade Organization. And we need to basically globalize land and input markets. But there was a study that came out. Oh dear, 5 minutes. There was a study that came out called the ISTAD, the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development. This is very interesting. Something like 200 scientists work on this study. And the World Bank was behind this. The bank does some very good studies. They just don't pay any attention to them. So the World Bank did this study, and these guys worked for 4 years. And actually, Monsanto and Syngenta went to the World Bank and said, you know, no one believes that we can save the world from hunger. Do you think you could produce a study that shows that we can actually save the world from hunger? And the bank said, oh yeah, we can do that. I don't know what happened here. They said, oh yeah, we can do that. So they cook up this study. They pull together all these scientists. But you know, scientists do a strange thing. Sometimes, not always. Rather than start with a solution, they start with a problem. So they started with a problem, and after 4 years of looking at this, what did they find? They realized GMOs are not needed. They're actually irrelevant to ending hunger. One, because they don't raise yields. They don't raise intrinsic yields. They can lower losses in industrialized agriculture, but since most of the world is not industrialized agriculture, they're completely irrelevant. And they really cannot address climate change. I mean, we can talk about that in the question and answer session, but basically they're irrelevant to climate change. And that the free trade agreements, which supposedly are going to help feed the world, most of the benefits go to northern countries. And if you talk about ending poverty and hunger, well, poor farmers only get about $2 per year per farmer. You're not going to end poverty or hunger that way. So they said, no, what you really have to do is change towards an agroecological approach and focus on local food system economies. Keep that food dollar in the community. Develop the local economies that way. I'm going to skip forward here. Well, you can imagine that people have not sort of sat back on their hands as their food systems were being destroyed. They defend their food systems, they innovate, we've developed agroecology and organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture. I was involved with a farmers movement called Campesino, about 250,000 farmers spreading sustainable practices across Latin America, into the Caribbean, into Cuba, into South America, and now into Africa. And basically, I think what we have to realize is that these small farms are really a planetary ecological asset. I don't think we can do without these small farms, both because they employ so many people. If you were to push the world, the 2 billion small farmers off the land and industrialize, you might be able to feed the world with those industrial farms on the best lands with all the best inputs and all the best credit. I don't know if you could do it very sustainably, but where would you put all these people? We don't have another industrial revolution to suck up all this surplus. The economy would have to grow at something like 15% a year over the next 50 years in order to absorb all this labor. People have to stay on the land. Otherwise, we're doomed. And the best way to do it is through a healthy smallholder agriculture. And that means that we need to shift towards food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is basically people's control over the food system, not corporate control over the food system, because we've seen what that has done. I'm going to end with a difficult concept. And that is, we live in a time of a corporate food regime. There have been 3 food regimes through the course of history. The first was a colonial regime. It used cheap inputs and cheap food from the global south to subsidize the industrialization of the north. After World War II, the flow is reversed. The north begins to overproduce grains, has to destroy the agriculture of the global south in order to open up its markets. Now we're in a third regime called the corporate food regime, and it's much more complicated. Basically, food flows north, south, east, west. It's dominated by these corporate monopolies. And you think of a regime as all of the institutions and all of the rules which govern the food system. So the World Bank would be one institution. The U.S. Farm Bill would be one of the rules. It's a rule for the world, by the way. It sets the price of food, sets the price of grain for the world. No one really votes for it. It's insulated. We don't even vote for it. It's insulated by all these committees, so you can't get at it. It's one of the pillars of late capitalism. They're not going to even mess with it. And certainly USAID and big philanthropy increasingly plays a role in the corporate food regime, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example. Now, if there's nothing else you remember from my talk, because I packed a lot in, please remember this. We have a capitalist food regime. Now, why is this important? Because it acts the way capitalism acts. And we know a few things about capitalism. We've been studying it for a couple hundred years. And as Karl Polanyi pointed out, capitalism always goes through 2 phases, a period of liberalization and a period of reform. During a period of liberalization, you let the market run wild. And you get an incredible concentration of wealth during that period. Think of the roaring 20s in this country, right? And then you get a crash. You always get a crash. Think of the crash of 1929. And then you get a reformist period where production is controlled, markets are controlled, supply, consumption is all regulated in an effort to restabilize the regime. Think of the New Deal, right? Now, these are both two sides of the same coin, basically. And the other important thing to realize is that reform does not come about just because of the goodwill or the intelligence of reformists, even though FDR was a man of goodwill, very intelligent. He came about because there was what was called a counter-movement. In other words, markets, if they were allowed to run rampant indefinitely, would eventually destroy the material and social basis for the reproduction of capitalism. And people revolt. They push back. They say, we can't take this anymore. They're unemployed. They've lost their farms. They can't feed themselves. They take to the streets. They organize. They join political parties. That's the counter-movement. And it creates the political will which allows the reformists to institute reforms. So we thought we were coming into this period in 2008 and 2011. Here are the crashes, right? Now it's time for reform. We did not have a strong enough counter-movement in order to initiate those reforms. So basically, neoliberalism has retrenched. We're still in this uber market period where everything is resolved through the market. Well, everything doesn't get resolved through the market. Things are getting worse, as I think Roz's presentation showed yesterday. Okay, this is really it. And this is complicated, but you can look into our literature on the Food First website and get more deeply into this. But I think this really concerns particularly people like the ones in this room. We know what the corporate food regime is. It's got a neoliberal trend and it has a reformist trend. The neoliberals are very strong. It's all about the market. It's all about privatization. It's all about the corporations. It's all about industrialization. The reformists are weak. They believe in all the same things, except they want safety nets. They want to limit the role of the market a bit. They want more public-private partnerships. They want to mainstream good things like fair trade or organic, through certification and whatnot. Roundtables for sustainable palm oil, these types of things. That's all part of the corporate food regime. And then we have the counter-movements. And if you look at the world today, the strongest counter-movement against the neoliberalization of everything is the food movement, which in the South are primarily peasant movements, and in the North are primarily consumer movements. All right? And the food movement also has two trends. One is a kind of a transitional trend, and the other is much more transformational. Or you could say one is progressive and one is radical. And I would say transitional or progressive here in the US are like the food justice movement, about fair access to good food, right? And about agroecology and organic farming and smallholders. Whereas the more radical transformational movement is about food sovereignty. It's about making the decisions. It's about democratizing the food system, redistributing the control over the resources of the food system. It's about entitlement more than empowerment. And it's much stronger in the global South than it is here in the North. Now, here's my final hypothesis for you. I think that if we really want to introduce reforms into the corporate food regime, we need history tells us we need a strong counter-movement. Otherwise, it can't happen. It won't happen. This transitional trend, you folks, that's you. You're part of this transitional trend. You're the progressives. If you ally yourselves with the reformists, and I'm not talking about tactical alliances, I mean real strategic alliances, when you have the same goals. Not you're going to accept some money because you need to put, you need to implement a project. No. You have the same goals. If you ally yourselves with the reformists, what will happen is that the counter-movement, the food movement, will be split and weakened. And it will never have the strength it needs in order to force reforms onto the regime, particularly transformational reforms. But if you ally yourselves with food sovereignty, with those who are looking for structural change, an end to the WTO, take food out of the WTO, an end to the dominance of the Farm Bill in the world, rebuild grain reserves, locally controlled grain reserves, decommodify seeds, these types of things. If you ally yourselves with that, then, I'm not sure why this is, my computer is not. Okay, if you ally yourselves with the transformational trend, then I think we have a chance of building a very powerful food movement, a very powerful counter movement, which might be able to introduce reforms, which might be able to create the political will for reforms. We don't know. But I think that is the challenge. And exactly how to do that is what we have to work out. And I want to just end with, I want to thank Doug and Teresa and Naomi for taking me on Monday up into northern Vermont. And I'd never been here, and it's gorgeous. And I was raised working on dairy farms, and so here are these little farms about the size of the ones that I grew up on, 50 years ago, and I'm pretty stoked, God, this is great. Also, it's not winter, right? So, and I'm feeling very nostalgic as we're driving along, forgetting how I ruined my back working on those farms, and you forget about the bad things, you remember the good times. And then we stopped to visit some of the farm workers, and they're clearly all from Mexico, and I could tell by the accent from southern Mexico. It turns out they're from Chiapas. And I thought, oh, these are the folks that I worked with for over 20 years. These are the ones who taught me agroecology. I love these guys. And we stopped at Josefa's house, and she gave us tamales, and then we stopped with Tirsi, and he took us to his garden. And of course, there's the garden project with the farm workers because they want to be able to grow their own food. But then I realized, and I thought, oh, this is like campesino. You can get together and farmers can visit farmers and they can share agroecological knowledge and you can build a nice movement. And then I began to be disabused of that notion because, in fact, these farmers never leave the farm because they're too close to the northern border, and the Border Patrol, ICE, is constantly patrolling, and if they get picked up, they're going to be incarcerated. They're going to go to the concentration camps down on the southern border and then be deported again, and they can't afford it. There are people who don't leave the farm for years. And I was so taken aback, and I suddenly this great sadness entered into my heart, and I still can't shake it. I've been thinking about this since I got here. It's like, I know these people. These are family people. These are people who have deep, rich village life, a culture, a social culture that in which tremendous agroecological knowledge is stored, and we need that, not just the seed, we need the peasant culture. And here I see these people being stripped, not just of their labor, but of their culture. Now, the farmers aren't bad farmers, they're a rock in a hard place. But I've never seen such solitude amongst farm workers in my life. And so I'm really torn here today. I'm so happy to be here in Vermont. I'm so impressed by what I've seen. I'm so excited by the dialogue we're having. And yet, I'm torn because I see this deep cultural suffering, and I think this must be the epitome of it, this tremendous solitude, which I think is part of the violence of the corporate food regime. This is a structural problem. To change that, we need to build a very strong food movement. I'm very proud to be a part of it with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for that. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so as we did yesterday, please approach either one of the microphones on either left or right. So we have our first question.
Hi, I guess this is on. I was really thrilled with everything you had to say, and I couldn't agree more. And I very much appreciated you mentioning Polanyi and his approach to this, but I think it's critical for everybody to remember the real point of his writing was to try to explain the emergence of fascism. And where did that come from? How did that happen? Out of the kinds of structural crises that you're describing. And in fact, it links directly with what you're talking about here, a kind of institutional repression of people being able to talk freely, get together, understand how they're being affected, and come to solutions. So I just want to warn everybody here, he was really writing about the emergence of World War III and conditions where people emerge who say, I can put control in this chaos, give me all the power, Hitler, give me the power, I'll put a stop to this chaos. So beware of that, and especially beware of anybody who tells you you can't freely associate, you can't move off the farm, you can't talk to people who share the same problems that you do. So it's more a comment than a question, but it's very important for people to understand he was writing about how fascism happens.
Thank you for that. Yeah, basically the crisis of liberal markets is resolved historically in two ways, either through progressive reform or fascist reform. So World War II is an example of that. You have the fascist reform of Germany, Japan, and Italy, and then you have the progressive reform of FDR, which means that politics matters. It means that it's not enough just to have a counter movement. The political content of that counter movement is also very, very important. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Megan O'Rourke. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. After I finished my PhD, interestingly, I had the opportunity to go work for the Foreign Ag Service and then also for USAID. So I have an interesting inside perspective, and I've heard all those things from their angle also. You mentioned an interesting statistic about 70% of women peasants grow food, and 70% of food is grown by peasants, and most of the hungry people are women and peasants. It occurred to me that that dynamic is probably because most of those women peasants don't actually own the land, and I was wondering if you have a sense of what proportion of cropland is actually owned by, say, the big corporate, larger entities versus the small peasant farmers.
Yeah. I don't have that information at my fingertips. The fact is that ownership in much of the global South is under there's a different idea of ownership. Our idea of ownership is about private ownership of the land, and so that it can be sold and traded, commodified. It's one of these false commodities that Polanyi talked about. And the problem now is that the smallholders, particularly women and girls, don't have enough land, and they're poor. So they produce, and then they sell right away, because they need the money because they're poor, and they sell when the market is glutted and the price is low, and 6 months later they have to buy food when the price is high, and that's when they grow hungry. If they had more land, if they had credit, if we had a bigger social wage in the countryside around the world, health, education, and welfare, schools, clinics, all these things. If the countryside was a better place to live, you subsidize production, you subsidize rural life with a surplus from the cities into the country so that the country can produce food and maintain livelihoods in a decent manner. So what's happening now is that the World Bank is trying to convince countries to give title to land around the world under the assumption that once people have title to land, then they can access credit, then they can begin to accumulate, then they can pull themselves out of poverty. And of course, since they don't change anything else, what inevitably happens is the minute people get title to land, they sell it because they need the money. They're poor and they need the money. And then they stay poor after that. So just titling and private property is not the answer. There are many different property regimes which should be respected and worked with in order to ensure the usufruct of the land in a way which can ensure these livelihoods. Because again, I think that the challenge is how can you keep people on the land and make the countryside a decent place to live? Certainly those buying ranchettes know that the countryside is a decent place to live. But we should make it a decent place to live for everybody, particularly people who produce our food. So this really is about resource redistribution. Land producing, food producing resources need to be distributed in a way that benefit the producers.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Newton. I'm an adjunct faculty at UVM. I'm teaching urban and peri-urban agriculture in the fall, and I'm collecting a lot of material for that course, and this, your presentation is wonderful for that purpose. I'm puzzled by this. We have a reform rebellion going on against all of the forms of control in the United States right now. It's called the Tea Party. They are very unhappy with the controls that are being exercised. Yet somehow the Tea Party has been turned anti-government, anti-reform, anti-regulation, when they need the exact opposite. The rich are not the ones who are members of the Tea Party. Can you tell me how that fits into your chart?
Yeah, well, neither are the poor.
What?
I said the poor, neither are the poor members of the Tea Party. The Tea Party tend to be middle class, and are threatened. I read a bit about this. I mean, they're threatened by globalization, basically, and they're financed by the Koch brothers. I mean, and I would say that they are probably the epitome of the pre-fascist tendency that Polanyi spoke about. So those types of, that type of counter movement is a very dangerous. Pre-stage is a very dangerous counter movement with strong racist foundations and strong fascist history. And you look at Clive Bundy and the not wanting to play the BLM for running cattle on BLM land, and then all these militia members coming out there like this is going to be the Republic of Nevada or something. That's just, these are the types of that's like the Phalange back in Spain during the Civil War. I mean, these are basically larger landholders that want to do what they want to do. And I think that Clive Bundy's remarks on race are very typical of this type of a trend. And I think that that's absolutely toxic. I mean, this country is going to be, white people are going to be the minority in this country very soon. It's people of color who are the majority. And we have to understand that unless we begin to recognize white privilege and dismantle white privilege, we're going to find ourselves in a place very much like South Africa did back in the late 70s. So I think that those types of tendencies really have to be rejected, and we have to put forward much more democratic social tendencies for within the food movement, which means doing things specifically like dismantling racism in the food system, dismantling racism in our food movement, dismantling racism in our own organizations and within ourselves, those of us who enjoy white privilege, particularly male white privilege like myself. I think that our food movement can't move forward unless we address these things. Our food movement will be weak, it'll be riven with contradiction, and it won't be powerful enough to do the job it's got to do unless we address these issues. So this may sound like I'm out on a tangent. You look at, we'll get to that. We'll get to the racist part, we'll get to the sexist part. Right now what we're trying to do is, do organic gardening, we're trying to, label GMOs. We'll get to these other things. And I think that's really erroneous. Dismantling racism and sexism isn't extra work, it is the work. We can't move forward without doing it. We can't make sure that we have a progressive, open, democratic movement without it.
I'm sure I speak for many when I thank you for the big picture, the holistic analysis that you're providing us, bringing all of the pieces together. We've all been working, many of us, on these issues and bringing them together for many decades. I'm speaking from Goddard College down the road where we try to put these pieces together. A brief personal comment. Your talk today reminded me of a brilliant professor I work with at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Harvey Goldberg. He used to say of capitalism, really is what you're talking about, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. So I just wanted to pass that along. Do you have any, can you speak to any places where you see progressive advances in urban areas? Certainly that's going to be crucial. Can you also speak and look around, talk about Brazil or India or China, your sense of what might be progressive opportunities in those crucial parts of the world as well? And broadly, where might you suggest we follow you and the work you are doing? Many of us want more information. Thanks so much.
Okay. Can we get my website on here? Thank you for that. In terms of capitalism, if you want to change the food system, study Capital. I don't mean Piketty's book. I mean the book, Marx's book, Capital. We cannot change the food system unless we understand capitalism, because it's a capitalist food system. And yet it's very hard to learn about capitalism anywhere until you get into grad school, and then you have a seminar or something. Google David Harvey. He teaches out of New York, and he gives a great course, an online course in capitalism, and he has 2 books. 2 textbooks which go along with it that can help you. But basically, we have to learn about capitalism. Otherwise, we can't learn how to build anything better, because that is our reality. It's always amazing to me, people think they can change the system without understanding it. Anyway, and look, the counter-movement, if you like, is growing all around the world and in the United States, everywhere you look. I mean, the list is long of people who are trying to change this food system, who realize it's not working for them. It's working for capital, but it's not working for them. And I'm not speaking against, entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, and we need this entrepreneurship. We need innovation. We need all these things. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this larger system, which has a tendency to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few and leave the rest destitute and destroy our capacity to feed ourselves sustainably into the future. So, I would say, whatever you're doing, I'm pretty sure in this room, I could safely say, whatever you're doing the right thing. Keep doing that. Whether you're farming, whether you've got a CSA, whether you started a farmer's market, whatever it is you're doing, keep doing that. We need to develop these alternative mechanisms in our food systems. These are different relationships in our food system. We need all these things, but it's not enough. On top of that, on top of the farming, on top of everything else, we have to organize politically. And this is going to be very difficult because we're such a diverse movement. So we have peasants in the global south, we have farm workers, we have food workers, and then we have all the consumers. We need to build alliances between all of us and all of our different immediate interests. Our longer-term interests are the same. So we need to converge in all of our diversity. So convergence and diversity is something you really need to keep in the front of your mind as you try and work these things out. We can't do it any other way. It's never been done. We don't know how to do this. In Spanish, you say, se hace el camino al andar. You make the road as you travel it. And we're going to have to make this road, and we're going to have to travel it. If we don't converge in all our diversity, we will not be able to change things. So I think that Via Campesina, for example, brings together peasants, fisher folk, pastoralists from around the world. They've got something like 2 million families in this International Peasant Federation. They're the ones who invented the term food sovereignty. Very important organization. The U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance has 60 or 70 organizations from around the country trying to address the issues of food justice and food sovereignty. And certainly, Vermont is the mecca of local food systems, Doug told me the other day. And I believe him. So work in Vermont, do that Vermont thing you guys do so well. But we also have to organize politically, nationally, and regionally. Certainly the Northeast region has to organize politically. We've got to change the rules and the institutions, because they're stacked against us. And we will never be viable or sustainable in the long run, no matter how much compost you put on the thing. This is Food First's website. It's a new website. We're very proud of it. I suggest you go there. To follow our work, we have all kinds of publications. Some are, academic journals. We have books. We have more popular, more publicly accessible publications. We take tours around the world called Food Sovereignty Tours. We go to 6 different countries: Cuba, Italy, Basque Country, Korea, Oaxaca, Bolivia. And the last thing I want to say, I would invite all of you to become members of Food First. Food First has been around for 40 years. We were started by an extraordinary woman named Frances Moore Lappé, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet. Much of what she said 40 years ago is still true today. And we've stayed alive all this time, not on the basis of grants, because grants come and go, foundations have their flavor of the month, and it's usually not a radical think tank like Food First. We stay alive because of our members and individual contributions, anywhere from $5 to $5,000 a year. And that's why we're a radical think tank. We take independent stances. We're not afraid to back off on the issues. I say radical, it's because we go to the root. And that's what I try to do today. And I invite you all to peruse our website, get a hold of us, work with us. Any students out there want internships, maybe we can work something out. A lot of our work is done with interns. And we have a broad net of colleagues around the world who help us produce some of this cutting-edge research. I'm seeing a sign that we need to wrap up. Thank you so much for having me. If you want to talk more, we can.